Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this session, I'd like to share with you some thoughts on a game that was played back in 2000 in the Women's Chess Olympiad in Istanbul. The game started out by white playing d4, which is, in addition to the king-pawn move, the most common starting move for white, which obviously opens up the diagonal of white's dark-squared bishop and also opens up the queen's file behind the pawn. Black responded by developing his knight to f6, which is certainly an ideal square for the knight, from where it controls immediately two center squares. Now white can play in various ways, developing, for example, by moving the pawn up to c4 would be the most common and ambitious move. On the other hand, there are a number of other moves that are quite reasonable, developing with the knight to f3, certainly equally good to the pawn to c4 move, and there are some less popular moves but well playable ones, such as developing the bishop to g5, or moves like g3 with the idea to then play bishop to g2 developing, or even the way white continued in the game by playing e3. Now, this move has something good about it and something not so good about it. The fact that we opened up the diagonal of the light-colored bishop on f1 is certainly a good thing. We also brought a backup to our d4 pawn in case it will be attacked later. It is safe and protected. At the same time, this move is a little bit passive in that the pawn only moved up one square and not two. Of course, the pawn could not move up two squares right away because the e4 square was controlled by black's knight, and therefore, if the pawn moved straight to e4, the knight would have captured that pawn. However, the other problem is that the pawn moving only to e3 locks up the bishop on c1. So that's certainly a less fortunate square for the bishop than if the bishop would be outside, that is, ahead of the pawn. For example, on g5 or f4. I have to add, though, that this is a minor type of mistake that certainly does not put white into an inferior position. And black now can respond in various ways as of how to develop the bishops. Black could play e7 to e6, certainly a logical, good way. Or another option would be to move the d-pawn up to d5, and that would be a queen's gambit type of position. Or continue as he did in the game by playing g6. The idea of this move is that the bishop will be developed on the a1 through h8 diagonal, which is called the long diagonal because it's the longest one on the board, at least of the dark-colored squares. And of course, after that, black will be ready to castle. As we know, in the early part of the game, our primary goal is to make sure our pieces get developed, preferably in a way that they can control the center, and to put our king to safety. White continued developing the bishop to d3, and as we can see, it controls a center square e4. And at this point, black responded by playing d5, occupying a center square and controlling now the e4 square a second time. In addition to the knight, the pawn also controls it, which means that white cannot advance the pawn from e3 to e4 without losing a pawn. And now white played an interesting plan that is quite practical because there's not much that black can do to prevent it. It's not that it's a winning plan, but it's at least a plan that can be rather dangerous if black doesn't know what to do against it. And even if black knows what to do, it still gives an about even game. Right now, if I were black, I would certainly play bishop to g7 and not the move black played, which was c6. c6 is an okay move, but certainly wasn't necessary at this time because white had no threat that black would have had to respond to. On the other hand, black delays a move further the development of her kingside. White continued with knight to f3, developing, and again, for whatever reason, black delayed the development of the bishop to g7 by playing knight b to d7. At the same time, these type of tiny mistakes, they are so minor that really on a beginner level, they are insignificant. White has castled. So white has done pretty well, developed the kingside fully, the bishop, the knight, and the king has castled. Now that white pawn already being on f4 ahead of the knight, again has something good about it and something bad. The good part is that it controls the e5 square, and therefore black cannot even think about putting any piece on e5 anytime soon. In addition, the white knight can have an outpost on e5 in the near future. Now, the drawback is that white, with having a pawn already on f4, has weakened the e4 square. The e4 square would be considered as a weak square because white can no longer control that square with any of the pawns. In the meantime, black has a pawn controlling that square, and black in the future may find a nice outpost for his knight on that very square. So black continued with e6, and that's a move that's not in harmony with black's previous moves. Black already has played g6, showing an intent to develop the dark squared bishop towards g7. The whole idea of playing e6 would be to develop the bishop on the other diagonal. Obviously, the bishop cannot be developed in both diagonals at the same time. So therefore, e6 is certainly not a good idea, because whenever you would have both the e and the g pawn move ahead, that means that black has less control along the dark squares. If black played e6 in this position to prevent white's f4, f5, I don't think that was something that black had to really be scared of. After e6, white responded by playing c3. Again, a move usually not really needed until black would play c5. So I don't think there was a rush to do that. I probably would have developed my second knight to d2. And after c3, black played finally bishop g7. Generally, I consider it a rule of thumb that when you play g6, you would want to follow it up by bishop to g7 right on the following move. And white continued, centralizing the knight by playing knight e5. To a move like this, you can react in two ways. Either try to trade and create double pawns for white, or just ignore it and castle and carry on with your own development or plan. I think in this case I would certainly choose the second one and just castle, and then try to develop my bishop on the queen side as well. In the meantime, black instead traded the knights on e5, and that gave white some initiative. White captured back with the f-pawn. Now, if just we look at it superficially, we would see that white has created double pawns for himself. 2 pawns on the e file. While true, that typically is a disadvantage, but in this case, white also has opened up the f file for the rook, so now the rook doesn't need to waste any further moves in order to get activated. And also, white, after a knight moves away, for example to d7, will have the opportunity to immediately play e4 and get rid of the double pawns on e4. Perhaps to prevent this, black jumped with the knight in this position to e4, which certainly prevents white from playing e4, however, it creates other trouble. In fact, white right now could win a pawn in just a couple of moves. Try to pause for a little bit and figure out on your own what should white do in order to win a pawn within the next few moves. And that move is to trade the bishop for the knight and then simply attack that pawn on e4. As you can see, the e4 pawn now is kind of separated from the rest of the pawns, and in fact, while black can protect it temporarily, on a long term, black cannot hang on to that pawn. For example, if the queen comes to the center to protect it, it would immediately step into a potential attack by pawn c3 to c4, chasing the queen away from that pawn, and after queen moves, knight will capture on e4, white not only winning a pawn but having a tremendous position with the holes on the black squares on d6 and f6. White would have a fantastic position. On the other hand, if black protects the pawn with the f-pawn by playing f5, that would be all good except for the fact that white can do right now the famous en passant. And after white captures on f6, the pawn on e4 will be falling as well. Okay, let's go back a tiny bit and see how the game continued when white did not do the trade on e4, which could have immediately brought material advantage for white. White responded by playing knight d2, which simply offers the exchange of the knights. Black cannot really prevent it very well, because, for example, if f5 would come, again, what would white do? En passant. That's right. Doing the en passant. Now the black knight needs to recapture, otherwise white wins a pawn by capturing black's knight on e4. And when the knight captures back, white finally has the opportunity to play e4 and gain space advantage. Or if black now would trade, now what we see is black having an isolated pawn on e6, which is a weakness, and at the moment black is also unable to castle because of white's rook on f1 prevents that. Let's go back again to knight d2, where black responded with the best option, and that was to trade the knights on d2. Moving the knight away to g5 would not be a very great idea, because then if white would attack now the knight on g5 with the pawn moving to h4, all black could do would be to jump back to e4. Okay, so the game continued with knight capture d2, and in a situation like this it's pretty obvious which white piece should recapture. The queen, right? No, just kidding. Of course not the queen. We want to make sure our bishop gets developed, and then the rook from the corner on a1 can get into play. So queen d2 would not be a natural move. Much better capturing back with the bishop. And now white pretty much has completed development. The remaining minor pieces, the two bishops, are developed. White has castled. And now it will be the time to make a plan. Black has castled, and now what should white do? they have double pawns on the e-file, although that double pawn on e5 certainly gives white some space advantage, which means that white has more space to maneuver for his pieces, and also it means that it restricts the mobility of the black pieces. As we can see, the black bishop on c8, for example, is buried away, and it's not so simple to position it anywhere where it has an active plan. Also, that same pawn on e5 is restricting the mobility of black's bishop on g7. And now white continued by playing e4, and now with this move white succeeds to exchange the doubled pawns on the e-file. Whether black trades and then white captures back on e4 or black ignores it, white will no longer have the doubled pawns. As black in this situation, I would be looking for some active moves, perhaps playing pawn to c5, in order to open diagonals for my bishop. Black responded by ignoring the situation and playing queen e7. Here white has a little advantage for sure, being more active. As we can see, the white pieces are more advanced, the black bishops are very restricted in movement, the f-file is open where the white rook is already pressuring black, and the white queen is ready to come out now too. For example, moving queen g4, getting closer to black's king, is certainly a move to consider. White played differently though, by capturing on d5, and now again the natural recapture is with the e-pawn in order to open up the diagonal of black's bishop on c8. And now the plan that white had was to play queen c1. Now the idea is to have an opportunity for the bishop from d2 to either move to g5 and chase the queen away and then go and sit on f6, or to exchange those same dark-colored bishops by playing bishop to h6. As black, again, I would like to see an f6 move succeed in order to exchange those pair of pawns so black's position will not be so cramped. But black missed that opportunity and made a kind of strange move that I don't really understand. Black played queen e6. I don't think the queen belongs there. And now white had a carte blanche, a free hand, to proceed with the plan. And that was to exchange the dark-colored bishops and then to safely position the rook on f6 and create a kind of brute force attack against the black king. For example, if now black would ignore what's going on, play bishop d7, white could trade bishops, follow it up by playing rook f6. And after this, depending how black plays, white could double up or even triple up along the f-file, perhaps, if needed, combine it with the pawn advancement on the h-file by playing h4 and h5, and continue with the attack. After white played bishop h6, black traded the bishops. This is generally not a great idea because it invites the white queen to come closer to the black king. And of course, as we know, the queen is the strongest attacking piece of them all. So therefore, generally, we want to keep it away from our king as much as possible. Black continued, bishop d7. So what do we see right now? Both sides are fully developed. There is even material. However, black has weakened the dark squares around the king. Moreover, the white queen succeeded to enter in between those black pawns that were supposed to defend the black king, and white has a very clear-cut plan. White needs to bring a support piece to attack together with the queen. And we can envision, for example, the white rook appearing on h4 followed by checkmating with queen h7. However, it's better not to do it right away, not to give black the chance to advance his f-pawn, clearing a square for a defensive piece for the black rook or queen to protect the pawn on h7. Therefore, white moved the rook to f6, making sure that f7 pawn stays where it is. Now black retreated with the queen, but let's check out why the queen didn't go to g4, closer to the white king. Well, the problem for black is that black will not have time to bring any other pieces to aid the queen in any kind of counterattack. In fact, the black queen could be trapped. For example, h3, and if the queen advances further to g3, all of a sudden rook f3, look at that, and the queen is trapped. Always be very suspicious of being surrounded by a lot of enemy pieces. If, on the other hand, the queen would move to h5, then all of a sudden white would shift direction and exchange queens, give up on the attack, but transfer that type of advantage, the attack, to material advantage by forking two pawns and, on the next move, capturing on h5 or h7. Let's go back again to the game. After rook f6, black continued with queen e7. And now, luckily for white, they have the time to leave the rook on f6 and bring the second rook. Play rook af1, double up, and now threatening indeed to come up with the rook to f4, then to h4, and then checkmate with queen h7. If black would try to prepare for that by playing king to h8, then white could continue the same way, also working, or even better, play bishop g6 right away, using two pins at once. The h-pawn cannot capture, period, because then the black king would be left in check, and if the f-pawn captures, then again black gets checkmated in just a couple of moves. In the game, in this position, black continued by playing bishop to e6, which doesn't defend at all against the plan, but there wasn't anything really that black could do. Rook f4, black continued with g5, which allows checkmate right away with queen h7. Well, what did we see in this game? We certainly saw an interesting plan for white that's worth testing out if you like this game. For black, well, be very careful in delaying the regular development, and first develop and only then generally look for aggressive, tactical, attacking opportunities. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess knowledge. Bye-bye.